My name is Kyle Cleveland. I'm with our TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. Since the 311 Tohoku earthquake, we've done a number of events and symposium dealing with these issues. And the event that you're attending tonight is a long time in making, in part because of the unusual logistics. We have Daniel Aldrich in Washington, D.C., who will be joining us by Skype, and Professor Suzuki here to begin with. So the way this will work today is that we will start with Professor Suzuki, and then there will be kind of an interactive presentation of Professor Aldrich's PowerPoint, and then we should be able to have a Q&A thereafter, including with Daniel Aldrich by Skype. So I appreciate your forbearance on the logistics of this, which are a little tricky. Daniel Aldrich, who's with us tonight, is an associate professor of political science at Purdue University. He's on leave this academic year as an AAS fellow at USAID in Washington, D.C. He's been a visiting scholar at the University of Tokyo's law faculty in Japan, an advanced research fellow at Harvard University's program on U.S.-Japan relations, a visiting researcher at Centre Americain Sciences Po in Paris, France, and a visiting professor at the Tata Institute for Disaster Management in Mumbai, India. He is a senior associate editor of the journal Asian Politics and Policy and a Mansfield CGP fellow. He has published 2 books and 18 peer-reviewed articles on issues on nuclear power, social capital, and disaster recovery. Along with Professor Aldrich this evening, we have with us Tatsujiro Suzuki. Professor Suzuki is currently a vice chairman of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission. Previously, he was the Associate Vice President of the Central Research Institute of Electric Power Industry, Japan, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics of Japan. He was a visiting professor of the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. He holds a PhD in Nuclear Engineering from the University of Tokyo, an MS in Technology and Policy from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Suzuki-san is a former member of the Puckwash Council. So, without any further ado, we'll get started with Professor Suzuki.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to be here today. Since March 11th, my life has completely changed. And as a nuclear, as introduced by Professor, as a nuclear, I've been working on nuclear energy policy issues for over 30 years. So as a research scholar for nuclear energy, and also now I'm a part of the government official. And I'm so, it is so regrettable as what happened. And keep thinking about 3 questions. One is, why did this happen? Why couldn't we prevent this accident? Second question is, how can we prevent this kind of accident in the future? The third question is, how can the people who are forced to evacuate from the homeland and living in anxiety now, how can they come back safely? And how to recover the Fukushima prefecture area? Those are 3 questions I've been asking every day. And also, it is our responsibility to share the information as accurately as possible, as quickly as possible, to the rest of the world. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So my presentation is based on those thinking. I start with this this summary, because if the time runs out, this is my message. The first message is that this accident, how serious this accident is. This is very, very serious, of course. It's probably the worst nuclear accident ever happened in the world, because 3 core meltdowns at the same time, 4 explosions involving 4 reactors, and then probably 100,000 people now are being evacuated from the Fukushima area, and yet still not under control. And that made whole other things, cleaning up the facilities and many other measures should be taken. Much more difficult. Still, technically, we are still in the phase of accident. The second point is that, of course, the first priority right now is how to reach the cold shutdown status. Means that there will be no more discharge, significant discharge from the site. And then recovery of life of Fukushima people. And then we start with the decontamination of the site, but it will take a long time. That's the third point. The decontamination and decommissioning of the Fukushima site will take decades. And it's very difficult to do. This is probably one of the biggest challenge for whole nuclear industry and for government to face. The fourth point is that the new energy policy. After this accident, of course, all energy policy, basic fundamental assumption that nuclear energy is a key part of the, nuclear energy, the key element of the Japanese energy policy, has been changed. So we have to create a new energy policy from the scratch. And right now, the only clear message from the Prime Minister is we will reduce dependence on nuclear energy. The rest is not clear. So we were starting the process since August, and my belief is that in order to recover the public trust, the transparency of the process is most important. Atomic Energy Commission is part of this entire government policy-making process and probably plays important role in specific nuclear questions. But overall energy policy will be made by ministerial level of Energy and Environmental Council. I cannot give you the conclusion right now because we are still on the debate, but I give you a sense of what's being discussed at this moment. Okay, those are the four messages I'm going to talk. Okay, this is a map of the Japan, and these are the four. Is this the pointer? No. Reactors affected by the tsunami and earthquake, and Onagawa and Tokai Dani was saved. And given the severeness of the earthquake and the tsunami, those are okay. For Fukushima also, only Daiichi suffered serious accident. This is the Daiichi site. You see the 6 units. The 5 and 6 are also now shut down, cold shutdown. There's a reason for this. Only 4 reactors are technically still in accident. Daiichi were also saved. What happened was, when the earthquake hit, it was a severe earthquake, so the transmission power was down. So there's no power to the plant. But don't worry, if the power is down, there will be emergency generators in the building. So for about 1 hour, it was okay. The regular cooling, emergency cooling power was available. But after tsunami hit, seawater pumps and diesel generator in the building was all gone. So so-called station blackout. No power was available in the reactor. No cooling capability, nothing. So that was a problem. And it took 14 hours to get back the power and to start the cooling again. Okay? And typically, if you calculate, we knew that probably within 4 or 5 hours, the core will start to melt. So we were very concerned at this point. Around 7 p.m. or so, the core will start to melt. So 14 hours is too long. And the diesel power generators will only last 8 hours. So that was the problem. Then we had a problem of exceeding the pressure, and the hydrogen generated in the pressure vessel was the contaminant vessel and then leaked to the reactor building and then finally exploded. The one diesel generator was saved in the Fukushima Daiichi 6, Unit 6. This is the reason why 5 and 6 were saved. What's the reason for saving this diesel generator? This is the only one air-cooled, not the water-cooled. And it was, of course, is located a little bit higher place. So this is, the one lesson is the so-called concept of defense in depth means in not just same diesel generators like this, but you should have a diversity in cooling capability. This one diesel generator saved 5 and 6. The regulation, safety regulation, severe accident in Japan was not critically, actually not well prepared. The assumption was the power will be back in a few hours. And so there was no particular consideration given to total power loss for a long time. And also the hydrogen explosion was assumed in the containment vessel. So there were measures to prevent explosion in the containment, but not in the reactor building. And also severe accident management means that if something like this serious thing happens, there's a manual to follow to deal with this accident. It was a voluntary regulation. It was not mandatory regulation. So those are the things, the lack of, I would say, safety regulatory aspects of the problem of this accident. Okay. For TEPCO, immediately after the accident, they claimed this was beyond their assumptions. But now they found out that there was a study done by TEPCO researcher, the possibility of 10-meter height tsunami could come to the area once in 1,000 years. And there was an evidence that they reported to NISA, Nuclear Industry and Safety Agency, regulatory agency, in June 2008, 2009. So about 2 years, this report was ignored. And March 7th, only 4 days before the earthquake, NISA was again briefed on this possible 10-meter height tsunami at Fukushima. So why could we do something about this knowledge? The problem is that there are so many reports like this. So the regulators should be capable of judging which one is important, which one should not be discussed. And also, TEPCO management should be also capable of dealing with this most advanced, up-to-date knowledge. This is probably so-called lack of safety culture. This is, you now know how dangerous the spent fuel pool is. If there is no cooling power, it could evaporate water and it could fire. This picture shows so-called dry cask spent fuel storage in Fukushima. This is the storage site of the spent fuel. And the tsunami also hit this building very severely. But the dry cask is naturally air-cooled. You don't need any forced system, engineering system. So even if they hit the tsunami, they lost the power also. This one is pretty safe. So this the second lesson here is if you can move spent fuel from pool to dry cask, you're much safer. Okay, this is supposed to be the system when the nuclear emergency happened. Prime Minister's office will set up the emergency headquarters in Tokyo, and the so-called off-site center will be the place that everybody gets together to share the information. In Fukushima case, about 5 kilometers from the site. And you cannot see much from this one, but there's a very sophisticated equipment there, so you can directly talk to the Prime Minister's office over the TV and share the information in a digital communication. But unfortunately, the earthquake, because of the earthquake, this place was not usable. There was no power, no communication. So this one has to move to Fukushima prefect, local government place. And the people need to go to the site. This is the Fukushima site. And there's a communication, direct communication between headquarters and Fukushima Daiichi site. But there's no direct communication between Prime Minister's office and this Fukushima site. So there was a lot of confusion in the first couple of days. And eventually, Prime Minister's office moved to TEPCO headquarters, and then they started to share the information very well. But before that, there was no digital communication, so all the information came by fax, paper, handwritten information. And Atomic Energy Commission was not part of the process, so we didn't get the direct information, but we shared the information with Nuclear Safety Commission. So the point is here, this is the lack of logistical preparation. If earthquake hit, this one was not available. We need some kind of backup in case of how to share the information in case of serious accident and earthquake. Okay, what happened to after that? This is probably so many times. This is a contamination map. The message here is the quantity of radioactivity compared with Chernobyl is roughly 1/10 to probably 1/5 around that time. The contaminated area is also compared with Chernobyl roughly 1/10. This is the area that you can guess, because the Chernobyl case went up very high, 200 meters, but this one didn't go up so much higher. So the severe contamination is relatively limited, but still, as you can see, the wind grows and contamination grows wider. Although the level is much lower, we can still find hotspot, even some Chiba prefecture area. So the decontamination of these efforts will take some time. This is the current evacuation area. Now this yellow part, the government said is safe enough that people can come back, but probably it takes 6 months or so for the people to come back to start the regular life. The most concerned area is this part, because they were not informed to evacuate, because this is a 30-kilometer range. They were outside 30-kilometer range. They were just living like the usual life. Actually, they were helping the people from Minami Soma City, and the people moved to this area, so they get more higher radiation. And so there was a criticism that why the government could not inform the Iidate village and the Minami Soma village that the window is growing this way, and there will be higher danger. It is difficult, actually. This is particularly the case. The problem was the March 15 and 16 when the explosion happened. On that day, you can see the wind was first window is moving south and then growing like this, and then eventually go this way. So in Japan, the window is growing, changing direction so quite often. So it's very difficult to determine which way is a dangerous way and which way is safer. But in any case, there was no enough information given to the local people. That was the problem. And now that people are coming back, and this is the problem: how low is safe enough? And this is the government decided that 20 mSv per year is the limit that you can come back. But of course, the regular life before the accident, 1 mSv per year is the regular limit. So there is a risk of getting radiation. Okay. The problem is, scientifically speaking, there is no clear cut which level is safe. So we have to determine with the public, with the local people, how high, how much risk are you willing to take? Going back to your home country, homeland, with some level of high risk of radiation, or you want to wait, or you want to give up the land. That's a social decision, it's not a technical decision. It's very difficult. Okay, beyond, this is the on-site now. Beyond, after the coal shutdown, we have to take out the debris of these buildings. The radioactivity still comes from this debris, so we have to clean up the site. And then there's a spent fuel still in the pool, so we have to remove the spent fuel into this dry cask. This will take roughly 3 years. And then eventually you have to take out the actually melted fuel. This will take probably at least 10 years, and probably more. This is very difficult because we know that this containment is fractured, it's broken, so we don't know where. And we don't know where this fuel is. So it will take, we need a remote control technology, a robot, and so on. So we have a lot of challenges to solve. Okay, I don't have much time, and let's go to the regulatory reform. The government decided to create a new nuclear safety agency, so-called independent safety agency. This is the key to recover the public trust under the Ministry of Environment. And the energy policy. This is the before March 11th Japanese energy policy. By 2030, the government was intended to increase nuclear power from current 30% to close to 50%, adding 40 more new reactors in order to reduce CO2 by 30%. But this plan is already scrapped. And the short-term problem is that the local public is so concerned about safety, they would not give go-ahead approval to the existing reactors. So the number of reactors operating is declining. Only 10 out of 54 right now are operating. And this will, all those 10 reactors will go into the annual inspection period by May 2012, and then all reactors could face shutdown. So we need a local public approval to restart those reactors, but it is very difficult at this moment because of the scandal and so on. And Prime Minister Noda said that we try to raise the safety of nuclear power plants to the highest level in the world. But it's a very nice sentence, but how to achieve this is very difficult to say, actually. And these are the three goals we have already announced. That first is for the energy policy. First is reduce dependency on nuclear power, and complete re-evaluation of nuclear energy policy. And this is the part that Atomic Energy Commission will be in charge. And also, so-called national consensus is the most important part of the goal. And this is a complicated chart. The point is that the Energy and Environmental Council created after March 11th by the three ministers, National Strategy Minister, and Energy METI, and the Environmental Minister. They will be responsible for making a final energy policy by next, probably summer. And Atomic Energy Commission is going to provide input regarding what to do with the nuclear power. Okay, all right. So I just want to show this. This is the public opinion poll showing that after March 11th, completely reversed. Now it's majority, over 60% of the public say, please reduce nuclear power, share of nuclear power, and probably phase out also. And so this is the current environment, and we are working on, this is the Atomic Energy Commissioners. And Atomic Energy Commission is working on the long-term nuclear energy policy. It was suspended in March 11th, and we are creating a subcommittee, which I'm chair, working on the technical details of the energy policy. Particularly, we just finished the cost evaluation. If I have more time, probably I'll be happy to answer all those questions. Thank you very much.
Professor Aldrich will speak as I move his PowerPoint along in his prompting.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Cleveland and Professor Suzuki. I'm honored to be part of this process. My wife joked that I was becoming a talking head, especially today that perhaps is actually true. As a social scientist, I also have a few questions about the 3/11 disaster, what we call a compounded disaster. And for me, the three questions are, how did Japan get here? What has been the response from civil society as opposed to the state? And what will drive recovery in the short, medium, and long term from this ongoing process? Next slide, please. So, in my mind, this disaster has brought out three larger issues we should be thinking about as social scientists. The first question is, where did these various policy tools come from that have allowed the Japanese government and the private utilities to create such an extensive commercial nuclear power program? How did Japan, in a sense, get here with these nuclear power plants? The second theme I think is important to talk about is that the response from civil society has very much been a bottom-up one, in contrast, I think, to almost 5 decades now of top-down policymaking by the Japanese government and by the private utilities. And finally, the third theme I hope to talk about today will be how the community recovery will very much be a function of their internal cohesion, the strength of the ties that bind people together. Next slide, please. So this first map I have shows the 17 or so communities in Japan that have hosted nuclear power plants, most of them since the 1960s. And looking over this map, you notice all of the locations for nuclear power plants are on the coast. And of course, an engineer would argue the reason they're on the coast is because these plants require water, cooling water, to keep the heat down. Of course, in France, they use lakes often, or rivers. In Japan, salt water has been used to cool the reactors. I think there's another reason why these kind of communities have been chosen. And in my first book, I've argued that the Japanese government worked with these power utilities, like TEPCO, to select locations for the 54 reactors across Japan. One big concern for the utilities was finding locations in Japan that they believed would be amenable, that is, not resistant to the idea of having a nuclear power plant in their backyard. Next slide, please. In that research project, I argued you actually can map out the chances of the Japanese government and these utilities completing a nuclear power plant. That is, what is the probability a nuclear power plant will be completed over time, holding a number of other factors constant, for example, the local income or the population level, the distance from Tokyo, but also looking closely at the issue of horizontal associations. And I argued in site fights that what really matters the most is the strength of the Gyogyo-Rodo Kumai, the local fishing cooperatives. So in this image, the x-axis, the horizontal axis, shows the change over time in the strength of those local fishing cooperatives. If the number is at 0, that means there was no change over time in the number of fishermen. Negative 0.5 means the fishing cooperatives, or the farming cooperatives in that locality, lost up to half the number of their membership. Positive 0.5 means they gained membership. And you can see here the predicted probability that a nuclear power plant would be finished over time against the strength of cooperatives. Where the fishing cooperatives, where local society was weakening over time, that is, where it's 0 or less, the chances are that nuclear power plant would be finished. On the other hand, where the strength of those local cooperatives was increasing over time, where it was 0 and greater on the right side, the probability of finishing the nuclear power plant dropped down to around 1 in 5. So in my mind, at least, the data we have shows locations like Okuma, Futaba, the other locations, Fukushima Daiichi, Niigata, Fukui, all these locations were chosen, not because they are only the best technically cited locations, but because these locations were envisioned as being areas where local civil society would be amenable and not fight back against the process of siting these kind of controversial facilities. Next slide, please. To assist the process of siting in these areas that had lower levels of social capital, that had less individuals able to fight back, the Japanese government has created a number of policy tools, including this slide of the Dengen Sanpo. The Dengen Sanpo are the 3 laws that promote electricity production in Japan. I had to use a scale on this slide of scientific notation. You'll notice that if you can read those numbers, it's actually 10 to the 11th. That means there are 11 zeros at the end of those numbers. That's the size in yen on a yearly basis of the amount of money that is flowing from a central fund the Dengen Sanpo has been collecting from electricity use. Every time that we in Japan turn on a blender or a rice cooker or a light switch, a certain amount of the money we pay for our bill is being sent to these kind of communities across Japan. In some of the communities that I visited during my field work, they receive upwards of 25 million US dollars a year in funding over time. And if you look closely at this slide, it actually shows 3 different numbers. One is over time, since the 1970s, how much money has been collected for the Dengen Sanpo. The other, slightly lower number, is how much money has been spent by the central government on projects, on soccer stadiums, on new roads, medical facilities, loan programs, business relocation money over time. The third number there is the leftover money, the money that hasn't yet been spent over those years because there aren't enough projects to go around based on demand. That is, there's more money being collected by the central government through the Dengen Sanpo over time than can be spent on a yearly basis. So these kind of financial incentives offered to local communities, like Okuma or Futaba in Fukushima, these are one of a number of different policy tools created by the Japanese government over time to smooth the way for these kind of often unwanted projects. Next slide, please. Another project, another way the Japanese government has tried to smooth the process has been through what I call a habituation visit. That means the Japanese government will fly you and your family, in some cases, to visit existing host communities for nuclear power plants if your community is slated to receive a nuclear power plant. If you're a farmer, for example, in Kaminoseki, in Yamaguchi Prefecture, and there's been a 3-decade attempt to build a new nuclear power plant complex in Kaminoseki, you will be flown, perhaps with your family, to visit someone like you in a community like Niigata, Kashiwazaki Kariwa, or in Fukui, and you'll spend time with someone who already has in their backyard a nuclear power plant. And the idea is to get you used to the idea of having a nuclear power plant in your backyard. This slide, in fact, shows a visit from local government representatives in Japan who came all the way to America, to San Jose, California, where, by the way, there are no nuclear power plants, and their job there was to see, eventually, the San Onofre and San Diego Canyon locations in California, and see what life would be like for them if they accepted a nuclear power plant in their backyard. Next slide, please. This is another policy tool used by the Japanese government to convince local communities that nuclear power plants are safe and necessary. So if your town were on the list of possible locations for a nuclear power plant, a scientist might come to your town and say why your town should accept this nuclear power plant. At this talk you're looking at right now, the scientist told people in town that nuclear power plants would ensure that Japan would meet its Kyoto Protocol obligations and help reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. And if this town volunteered and took on this nuclear power plant, they would be doing their duty to help Japan meet its national energy goals and national environmental goals as well. Next slide, please. This is the final example I'll give of a policy tool being used by the Japanese government. There are many others in my book I talk about, but this is the annual electricity fair at Makuhari Messe outside Tokyo, held on a yearly basis. And there, 2 years ago, 150,000 citizens came through to buy goods sold only by farmers and fishermen who live in host communities. You'll notice, for example, one of the banners there says Tohoku, right in front of you. The idea here, in these cases, is that back in the 1970s, many farmers and fishermen were concerned that if they accepted a nuclear power plant in their backyard, they would be unable to sell the products of their agricultural work, whether it's farming, fishing, sake. So the Japanese government told them, we'll take this fear you have of being unable to sell your goods and we'll transform it into a strength. We'll guarantee there's a market for you every single year to sell your goods as the host of nuclear power plant community. So that image that you're looking at comes from one of these annual electricity fairs held outside Tokyo. Okay, so far I've tried to answer the question, what kind of policy instruments have brought us to where we are? How did the Japanese government get localities like Futaba or Okuma to accept these kind of projects? The next question for us to answer now is, what has been the response from civil society? Next slide, please. This image comes from a new project, what I call citizen science in Japan, and the site is called Safecast. If you notice, this map, of course, is of the Tohoku region, and it's populated by little colored round circles. Those circles, in fact, are data points. Individual volunteers throughout Japan who have their own Geiger counters can record wherever they are, on the road, in their homes, in their businesses. They can record the current level of radiation that they're experiencing and upload that data with GIS information. So other people in Japan can know exactly where and when radiation levels are changing, if they're changing, or how high or low they are on a daily basis. So this map, as of today, has over 600,000 measurements taken not by TEPCO, not by the central government, but by citizens who have gone throughout Japan with their cars and Geiger counters. Why has there been this response? Well, initially, I believe, TEPCO and the government were deliberately slow in releasing information about the amount of radiation coming from the damaged nuclear power plants. In fact, we know quite early on that the American government, with its own radiation detectors, believed that the Japanese government's pronouncements were in fact not strong enough, and began encouraging American citizens in Japan and military personnel to pull out at a time when the Japanese government still had a very calm approach to the issue and told many people there was no larger need to be concerned about evacuation. Many citizens I've spoken to, including my own colleagues there in Japan, believed that this form of data was not transparent enough for people who didn't know who was putting the data out, where it was coming from, if it was being altered at all, or certain data were being suppressed. So this form of bottom-up citizen science has been one response from the public that's quite skeptical. In fact, I saw one poll a few days ago that showed 80% of people in Japan do not believe the data being provided by the central government, by TEPCO, or by other public or private locations, and they believe that citizen science might be the only way to get past this lack of trust. And of course, as Suzuki-sensei mentioned already, there already has been the Yorase mail scandal in Kyushu, where we know that this year, after the accident, a power utility told its own employees to call in and give their opinions by the possible restart of a reactor. So I think this bottom-up response has been one of them. Next slide, please. I'd like to show, if I could, just 30 seconds or so from a video. Kyle, can we start the video out?
福島県民も他の日本国民と同じく等しく無用な被爆をせずに生活する権利があるでしょう。
ないんですか？ないですか？あるんですか？
政府としてですね、できる限り被爆を少なくしていくという取り組みはしております。
答えください。
つまりないんですか？
あるのかないのか。
福島県は県民はどんなにことしてもいいの？
権利があるかないかは私は分かりません。
じゃああんたには何があるぞ。あんた自分で権利ないと思う？なあ、健康に生きる権利ないのか？言ってよ。
福島県民は人権がないですか？
福島県民だけ公衆衛生上の被爆で基準が違う可能性があるということですか？
That's right, yeah. So, for a long time, the power utilities and the government has held what they call public hearings on the issue of nuclear power, since the 1960s, in fact. Most of those hearings have been held with pre-screened individuals and pre-screened questions. That is, rather than having individuals able to answer and ask questions right there on the spot, most of the questions at these, quote, public hearings, unquote, have in fact come from pre-screened individuals. This video we just saw from Fukushima Prefecture, this showed how what anthropologists have called rituals of assent have been changing recently. Anthropologists in America and Japan have been studying how do citizens and the government, or citizens and the private sector, interact on these highly technical issues. In most cases, citizens are content to hear from someone like a scientist or a government representative their opinion and maybe simply nod their heads and say okay. So anthropologists call these kinds of interactions rituals of assent. They're rituals because in many cases there's no expectation that citizens will take an active role in the process. They're rituals because they're predictable. The outcomes are known in advance. Those rituals of assent have been strongly challenged recently, as we just saw, and I've been to a number of other public hearings in Japan, where local citizens are no longer content to hear from TEPCO or the government the standard opinion and simply accept it anymore. In fact, a third form of bottom-up citizen science and bottom-up response from civil society has been the large-scale anti-nuclear rallies taking place, not only in Tokyo and Fukushima, but elsewhere. I believe the Sayonara nuclear power plant rally back in September brought more than 50,000 individuals, again, who are not content to allow the status quo to continue. So in my mind, these three areas, the Safecast site, the blog that contains data points from citizens, these kind of angry responses from local residents, unwilling to accept the standard top-down bureaucratic approach, and also the large-scale demonstrations from citizens across Japan, have been signs that civil society is responding now to what they think is as a breach in both procedure and content. They want a more active role in the process. They want a dialogue as opposed to a top-down lecture, let's say. Okay. The third part of my talk, my next slide, please, now looks, given these ongoing problems in Japan, the compounded disaster of an earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear power crisis, how will the long term see the Toku recover? What can be done in Japan? What is being done in Japan? The standard theories of recovery can really be grouped into 5 different categories. On the upper left hand of the slide is an image of money. And I think a common assumption is if there's more aid given to a damaged community or a stricken community, somehow that larger amount of aid coming in will speed up the recovery process. So for example, in Japan there's been a push for the central government to provide more assistance and more funding to local governments, who by themselves simply cannot afford much of the cleanup process, decontamination process that this will require. Another theory of recovery is the top middle slide, and this is a theory of governance. And the argument is that if a prime minister or a mayor or a governor is competent and on top of things, some of the process of recovery should be a faster and more efficient one. So for example, Prime Minister Khan, who is known as being a hot-headed individual, has been replaced now with someone perhaps who's more calm. Many people have assumed that might bring about a change in policy. The upper right-hand slide shows an image of the 1923 Tokyo disaster, and the theory behind this image is that the more damage done by the disaster, by the crisis, the slower the recovery process. We know, of course, the tsunami killed more than 20,000 people throughout the Tokyo region, and we know that over 300,000 people were evacuated from their homes and have sought shelter elsewhere, with over 85,000 people still out of their homes from Fukushima, perhaps forever in many of these cases. And of course, the argument has been, with more damage, with more evacuation, the process of recovery will be a slow one. The bottom left-hand slide focuses on population density. Many economists argue that the process of recovery will be slower where population density is higher. And therefore, in Tohoku, where many of these villages are rural, fishing communities with low population density and depopulation over time, we should in fact see a faster recovery, for example, than if it were in Tokyo, let's say, or Osaka or Sendai. The final image in the bottom right shows existing levels of wealth. This image actually comes from the favelas in Brazil. The left hand of the slide shows the slums, the favelas. The right side shows condominiums, each of which have their own pool on their deck. We might assume that communities with more money or less money recover quite differently. So a wealthier community, for example, we imagine might have a faster recovery, and a poor community might have a slower one. Next slide, please. But I believe these theories of recovery overlook a critical aspect, which is the internal cohesion, the social capital, as we call it, inside the damaged area. And we think there are really three different types of social capital, three types of ties or networks that bring people together. The first we call bonding social capital. Bonding social capital has people who are quite similar, family, friends, neighbors, who are tied together often through webs of reciprocity, gift-giving, and exchange. So, for example, if you're a long-term resident in Japan, it's quite likely you know your neighbors quite well. You might exchange with them gifts or see them on a regular basis. We call that bonding social capital. Occasionally, though, individuals across ethnic, gender, and religious national lines cross to each other. We call that bridging social capital. For example, at an international school in Tokyo, or at a church, or an imam, or a synagogue, you might have a chance to meet people different than you, whose background is different than yours. A third and critical type, though, beyond bonding and bridging capital, is what we call linking social capital. Linking social capital is one involving a vertical hierarchy. When an individual in an area might know someone in power, an NGO, for example, the head of a town, maybe they know someone involved in the reconstruction process. That kind of link also can be critical in the process of recovery. I think there are really three mechanisms by which social capital plays a role in the recovery process. Next slide, please. The first decision that every disaster survivor must make is, do I go home, if I can, to a damaged community, to a damaged home, to a wrecked neighborhood, and rebuild whatever the costs might be? If they choose to go home, it's quite common that they'll use their political voice, so to speak, to work together with their neighbors and the people living nearby to try and change the process of recovery. On the other hand, individuals who have fewer connections back to their hometown, individuals who have fewer ties binding them to individuals nearby, might use exit. And in the research that I've been doing both in Japan, India, and elsewhere, I've shown that individuals with more social capital, with more ties binding them to networks, they show voice and not exit. On the other hand, individuals who have fewer ties, who are less connected to ongoing activities and people nearby, they're more likely to use exit and depart from the community and try to begin a life elsewhere. Next slide, please. We can also think about the recovery process as a collective action problem. How do you get people to work together at a time when information is scarce, when money might be not available, when information also not be available? How do you bring people together to work on common problems? So one of my colleagues has called this the collective action problem, because in areas where we're able to work together, it's far easier to overcome barriers to broad-scale mobilization. I'll give you two examples, one from Japan and one from America, of the ability to overcome, or the inability to overcome these kinds of barriers. In Kobe in 1995, after the Hanshin-Awaji Daishin-san, the large earthquake there in Kobe, the government of Kobe offered local landowners and condominium owners a deal. They told them, if you agree as an entire condominium to allow us to remove the debris from your area, if everyone signs off on this form, we'll agree to take away the debris for free. It'll be a free process. That sounds like a good deal, but fewer than half of all the condominium owners in Kobe eventually had this done, because most of them did not know how to reach their neighbors. They didn't have email addresses or phone numbers. They didn't know where they were staying. They were unable to get all those required signatures. So unfortunately for many condominium owners, the debris remained on the ground in Kobe until they used their private funds to pay for it later. On the other side, a positive story of collective action has come from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. There in a small community called Village de l'Est, made up primarily of Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans, they came back in October of 2005, and they wanted to turn the power back on to their community. The local utility told them only if they received 500 signatures over time would they be able to do so. They had 1,000 signatures in over a day and a half. They knew where to find people. They had kept in touch with their neighbors. They were able to get together and work as a group. Next slide, please. The final form of social capital after disaster, the mechanism by which it works, is what we call informal insurance or mutual aid. Often, during the disaster and afterwards, the normal sources for things that we need, medicine, gasoline, food, tools, those are shut down. Stores are shut down, government processes are shut down, hospitals are not working. So to get those resources, we may have to call on our friends of friends, and our neighbors. If we've invested over time in those relationships and have connections to people living nearby, then during a time of crisis, like the Tohoku disaster, we can get a ride out of town, or we can borrow a Geiger counter. We can get a place to stay someplace else, like in Sendai or Ishinomaki. We can find a place to live temporarily until we get ourselves back on our feet. With mutual aid, we're able to do those resources at a time when normal suppliers are not available. Final slide, please. So today I think I've had three major arguments. First is that the social networks in Japan have played a critical role both during the process of being selected as a community for these kind of nuclear power plants, but also in the process of recovery. That is, the ways people are tied together in Fukushima, in Iwagi, in Miyagi, and Iwate, those communities, their long-term fate, I believe, is much more a function of their internal cohesion than of the aid from the government, for example, or of how much damage was done by the tsunami. Also, I'm arguing that the response from citizens across Japan, in the Safecast blog, in the angry Fukushima exchange that we saw, in the large-scale rallies, I believe this is a new type of involvement, perhaps a dialogue that's beginning between civil society and the state. In many societies, and Japan is no exception, nuclear power has been an iron triangle where technocrats, bureaucrats, scientists, utilities have worked often in isolation from society to make decisions about nuclear power. I think we're starting to see now, hopefully, a broader engagement of common citizens in that process. And finally, I believe right now Japan stands at the crossroads of energy, concerns, civil society, and a green future. Japan's choices right now, I believe, will set the stage not only for Japan, but for societies like Germany, Switzerland, Italy. Japan's choices now are having an impact on the world, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. Thank you very much.
Okay, we welcome your questions. If you could keep your questions linear and brief, I need to repeat them so that Daniel can hear them. So, can you go ahead?
Okay, well, yeah, I sort of get a bit confused with the idea of bottom-up science. Science is either right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether it's popular or not. You mentioned a figure of 20 millisieverts a year as an arbitrary figure, but you know, there's places in the world where people live quite happily with over 100 millisieverts a year. So my question is, why not, if we want to protect the communities and make sure that the communities aren't broken up, why not just let people go back? What's the harm? Nobody's died, and people live with much higher levels of radiation.
I don't think that's simple, because first of all, below 100 millisievert per year, still there's a risk, and particularly for children, young children.
Not in Ramsar, Iran. Not in Ramsar, Iran. There's been no where people naturally live with levels of around over 100 millisieverts a year.
Well, statistically speaking, there's no evidence. So each individual may survive without no problem, but it could get cancer. So
where's the evidence?
No, there's no evidence.
Exactly.
There's no evidence.
So let people make their own judgments.
Well, it's not that simple, because we have already announced that. Listen, why then it's annual, in the regular before March 11th? Why we set 1 millisievert per year?
Because it's arbitrary. It's got no meaning. It's just a political. It's just a line in the sand.
Okay.
But base it on science. I think both of you guys are practicing top-down politics. I mean, just let people make their own decision. If they want to go back, let them go back.
Would you like to address that?
Well, but the point is, it's not. If people like you can come back, but other people don't want to leave.
Okay, well that's their choice, right?
Well, that's their choice, but it's hard to decide. Okay, if they demand the decontamination, how can the government should respond?
If they demand, well, I might demand anything.
You don't demand anything.
I could demand anything. Base it on science.
Yes, I agree. But the point is, the government needs to respond. The problem is now what's happening in Fukushima. Let me tell you the reality right now. In Ida village, the mayor said he wants to clean up the village so that people can come back in 2 years. Okay? That's the mayor said. It would take a long time, actually take a huge amount of efforts to clean up the site, the village.
You're assuming that it's dirty to an extent where people can't live.
Wait. That's what the mayor said. The problem is the local people are divided now. The older people who have a land to farm, they want to come back. Okay, they want to keep the farming. So they demand to clean up as much as possible. We have a responsibility to respond. But on the other hand, this is in general, the younger generation who did not do farming, they don't want to come back. They were happy to get compensation money to live outside. So the town is divided.
Why not let them decide for themselves?
Thank you. If we could allow Daniel to respond.
I think I hear in the question a broader question of governance and the voice, in a sense, and that's how I hear the question at least, which is, isn't there some role for individual choice in the process of coming back home? And of course the answer is yes. People snuck back into Katrina when the city was shut down. Individuals in India and Southeast Asia came back during the tsunami warnings themselves. That's always, of course, a problem. Governance is the process of making the improbable possible in many cases. And Japan right now has to figure out what level of risk is acceptable not only to the government, but to society. It's true, as you're saying, in some societies, background levels of radiation may be higher than the current levels that are restricted by the government. That may be the case. But the process of governance means that laws are set nationally, and there's often very little flexibility in the process given to local citizens who want to make their own choices. So, of course, you're right. Individuals who want to sneak back into Fukushima And we know there are farmers, for example, living outside Itate and other who have not left. There are cattle behind. There are still individuals who have chosen to live in areas that are dangerous. The government's job is to provide as best as possible its opinion on what's safe. So again, in my mind, this is one of those areas where a dialogue more broadly would allow the government to work with citizens, citizen scientists, for example, from a bottom-up perspective, and figure out what is for Japan a safe and acceptable level. We haven't really talked about the fact the Japanese government itself has changed now during the disaster its acceptable levels. They've been raised and dropped again as local opinion has changed, as popular opinion has changed. So I think there always is space for feedback. The question is, as a nation, what does Japan think a safe level for its people?
Thank you. Another question?
I'd like to make a comment on question number 2 Professor Suzuki has raised. I think the question was, how can we make sure something like this never happens again? I have run into this question in basically the same formulation in many occasions, and I think it is dishonest to ask it like this. The question is not, how can we avoid a Fukushima incident? If you have a look at all the incidents that had happened, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, the reasons were different, processes were different. Never in the history of nuclear energy, the same accident has happened twice. And still, we had 3 big incidents in just 25 years. So the question should be, the answer, honest version of asking this question is, how many more disastrous accidents are we, as human beings, ready to take if we want to pursue this technology? It's just a comment, not a question to add up to this field of subjects. Thank you.
Would either of you like to respond to that? Okay. Okay. Next question.
My question is, how was the decision made on the radius, so 30-kilometer radius? Because as you showed, radiation doesn't spread evenly, and Chernobyl example showed that it was also sporadic. There were hotspots outside the evacuation area around Chernobyl, and there were clean areas inside the evacuation area, like here around Fukushima Daiichi. Why not just concentrate on the hotspots and the free up zones for people to recreate, to go back to their community and live their life?
The decision is made in the first couple of days without knowing much about this radiation map. And the law, it was only prepared the first 3 kilometers evacuation and up to 10 kilometers. That was the only legal requirement we had. So beyond 10 kilometers, it's just the Prime Minister's decision. And based on what? Based on some rough calculation of the possible damage based on this, what's happening. At that time, the first couple of days, as I said, lots of confusions. And so the government prepared the worst case, and 30 kilometers is probably good enough to evacuate people. And NRC, US NRC said 50 miles, which is much wider. But depending on how you measure, how you look at the numbers, the decision could be different. Also, people, naturally, the foreign government may be more conservative because they can leave the area easily, but not the big population. So 30 kilometers was that was the decision we made. Well, right now, we are re-evaluating again what happened and trying to expand this evacuation zone up to 50 kilometers. And also the more critical thing is, so-called speeding, which is the computer simulation to predict which direction, how far the radiation goes. So we need to go back and investigate what happened. But in any case, we have to re-evaluate emergency planning so that the people, it is true that the two things. One is the government was not prepared well to respond to this situation. But the second is the information was not given to the local community. So people just spend normal life for the first couple of days, even after the explosion, and without knowing the radiation is coming. That was the worst thing that happened. It's still better than Chernobyl, but it's for the local community, it's very bad.
Daniel, do you have anything to say on this one?
Just a quick comment. One of my colleagues, Lee Clark, has written a book called Fantasy Documents. He argues that in America or elsewhere, attempts to normalize risk about nuclear power plants or airplane crashes or whatever have led to very unlikely to be filled, but on the books, evacuation plans. So for example, in America, the Indian Point reactor sits 33 miles from Manhattan. If we use a 50-mile reactive 50-mile radius around the plant as an evacuation zone, that would mean over 15 million people in New York would have to evacuate if there were a similar problem at Indian Point reactor. One of the things that we saw in Japan was not only that the concentric circle approach, which is the standard approach, didn't map well onto the actual radiation spread. We know, for example, the winds carried northwest into Itate, but we also know people who should have evacuated didn't. People living nearby did not take potassium iodine pills, even though that would have been one form of defense. And people further away from the zone did leave, even though the dangers to them were much less. So we call that the shadow evacuation problem. People who don't need to be evacuating often leave out of concern and anxiety. People who should be leaving don't. So I think, as Professor Suzuki has said, for both America and Japan, the broader question is, how do we redesign these existing evacuation plans and disaster management plans to make them no longer work as fantasy documents?
Thank you.
Even if the existing nuclear power plants stay in operation, we still have to deal with the fuel that comes out of them. And that means other facilities than just the nuclear power plants. It means reprocessing plants, or it means more dry cask storage plants. And eventually, we're going to have to build more of those facilities. How do you see this accident as the impact of this accident on how those additional facilities are going to be accepted by communities? Even though they're not new reactors, they're still new things that have to do with nuclear power. Is there going to be a problem in getting those things built? And what happens if we can't build them?
Short answer is still unknown, because we haven't discussed the local community, with the local community, what to do with the spent fuel. But my personal feeling is that it is more difficult to move a spent fuel or leave a spent fuel on site. Although as an engineer, I feel confident if I explain very well that the safety of the dry cask storage, it is much safer to store spent fuel in the dry cask storage. If that is acceptable, maybe some local community we need to accept. Actually, Mutsu City, in northern part of Japan, accepted spent fuel storage in the dry cask storage. And
After 3/11? Or
no, before. Sorry, before. But still, because of the safety of this is safer, much safer than the spent fuel pool. So, but the whole point of the, like Daniel said, losing the trust is the key. So, who is going to explain to the public about the safety of the dry cask? That's the question.
Daniel, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, just quickly, we've had a very interesting cycle, I think, among local mayors and governors that I talked to at least. Initially, after the first few days and weeks, many mayors of host communities elsewhere in Japan said this does not change our mind at all, we're still committed to nuclear power. Then after about a month and a half, 2 months, we saw a shift, especially as Prime Minister Khan himself seemed to put up new barriers for the restart of plants. Once he called for a testing simulation to be done, many mayors I'd been talking to and that were being polled then said, wait a minute, if the Prime Minister himself thinks there might be a problem, then I'm going to withdraw my support for the existing plant restart. So I think initially there wasn't anxiety or concern among other host communities. As I mentioned during the talk, a number of them depend economically, $20 or $30 million a year US on these plants. But over time, I think we've seen a shift away from acceptance and trust toward a cycle now of skepticism.
Okay, next, go ahead.
My name is Sadaki Nomata. Daniel, I've known you since your Abetelo days. And I know that you experienced Katrina. And you were researching reactions to disasters a few years ago. Now, you made this very interesting point about the role of social capital and networks, also about the bottom-up citizen science protests and anti-nuclear movements and so forth. What is your recommendation in terms of governance on the part of the central government? You mentioned dialogue, the need for dialogue. Well, what else would you recommend?
Thank you very much. It's good to talk to you again. So I think what's been missing so far in this, to my count, I think there are 5 different commissions right now that are meeting in the Diet on this issue. 5 different groups and meetings. Most of them lack a citizen representative, not a scientist, not someone from the scientific community, but simply someone from Japan, from a host community. I would very much like to see in the process of dialogue on nuclear power, on long-term waste storage, on the restart of the plants, I would very much like to see more active citizen involvement in the official panels, in these commissions, in these e-inkai. I would like to see that. I think in other communities, whether America or India, after disaster, one of the interesting things we saw was a shift. Many survivors of disasters felt very strongly. They had a voice they wanted to make public now. And I think we haven't seen enough of a reach out from the government to citizens throughout Japan, whether in Tohoku or elsewhere, to get involved in decision-making processes, to open up the broader decision-making processes in the same way that the jury system, the trial by jury, is just beginning now to spread in the judicial system. I would very much like to see more civil society involved in the decision-making processes about nuclear power, for example, and the energy policy in Japan.
Thank you both for your interesting lectures. I had one question that could be combined with those last remarks. The title of the seminar was 2 words, Japan's energy policy. And I wonder for both of you, what would be the lessons learned from the events and, both from a technical stand and a social stand, for this process in developing a new energy policy?
Should I?
Go ahead. Dozo, second you.
Okay. Well, the lesson we learned is that the risk of technology, and also as Daniel said, lack of inputs from citizens into the national energy policy. The third point is, I think this is my personal probably thought, but the role of scientists, engineers in so-called social public affairs, particularly after the accident. As Daniel said, so-called citizen scientists provided many information, and so-called established scientists didn't do much. And they were waiting for so-called certain data. And although they did, I should give them credit, they did issue a statement and guidance, recommendations, and so on. Was very courageous for them to do it without much knowing it. But from my standpoint, the government doesn't help much, because we need specific numbers, data, actions in case of actual dealing with the crisis. In student times, the citizens organization did much better job in those cases. So those are 3 lessons. But for the future energy policy, it is a turning point for not just energy policy in Japan. The safety regulation and food safety regulation is right now in the trouble right now. We have to come up with a new standard. So I think that maybe it's the governance, maybe the good word, have to be changed to some extent. That how to deal with the so-called scientific technical issues in the public affairs. That's my personal.
I think we've seen very different lessons taken by different people. So my colleagues, like Miranda Schroers, for example, in Germany, in Italy, in Switzerland, in their mind, the lesson learned from Fukushima and from the Tohoku disaster, that the costs of nuclear power aren't worth the benefits. Now that lesson was not taken, for example, by Chinese or Russian or British decision makers, who all have the same plans they did before 3/11. Decision makers in Italy, Germany, and Switzerland, on the other hand, have a very different calculus now for the future. They're willing to spend billions of euros to change the mix of energy in their countries. And I think this broader dialogue about the costs and benefits of nuclear power in Japan has really yet to take place. Much of the presence we have in Japan of these reactors has come about because of a top-down, governmental-driven push, beginning way back when, in the 1950s, with Nakasone, actually. Nakasone was one of the first Giin, the Dai members, to push very hard for the idea of the peaceful use of the atom for nuclear power program and so forth. So I think the broader question for me as a lesson would be, what are the costs and benefits? How do we discuss that? One of my colleagues here in America, Charles Perrow, has called this the normal accidents. In other words, that we have to assume normally that very complicated technical machinery, whether an airplane like the Boeing 707 or nuclear power plant with literally hundreds of miles of pipes, wires, tubing, we have to assume these systems can fail. And one of the things that I've seen, at least among my engineering colleagues, is a certain hubris, a certain arrogance about defense in depth, for example, the small chance of the problem. When you have the tremendous catastrophic outcome, like we saw in Fukushima, then I think we should take more seriously as a community even the very small probability of an accident and talk through, if we do have these technologies in place, what risks are we willing to accept, and whose backyard do these risks come in?
Thank you. My name is Chris Worth. I'm from Purdue University. I have a question probably for both of you to ask or answer from your perspectives. If we looked at the reactions of people in Tokyo, so far away from the disaster zone, during the days after March 11, I think we could see 2 extreme reactions. In one way, people are very scared and don't know what to do and want to go away. They immediately left if they could. And on the other hand, you had people who said, well, we believe the government said it's 10 kilometers or 30 kilometers, we are safe, and they try to continue their lives as they always did. So my question would be, how big was the possibility, or how close were we to a scenario where these 4 reactors and the spent fuel pools would blow up more drastically and create a situation where not only Tohoku but Kanto area would not be safely inhabitable for decades? How close were we to this scenario? And probably for Professor Aldrich, you alluded already to that question, but how much is that kind of psychological effect involved in just not wanting to accept a scenario in which we completely need to change our lives?
You mean the how close this accident, how serious was it, that so that maybe the Tokyo may be the area that we have to evacuate? It wasn't that bad. I think the worst case scenario not me, but I think the worst case scenario based on the data we have, Tokyo was probably safe. I would say. From now, you see hot spots. You can still see the hot spots, and then from now, the future for all Japan, food and water contamination could be serious, and so the monitoring of food and the water is very important in the future. It's no longer air external exposure; it's going to be internal exposure. So that's the future consideration. But in terms of serious accident, we are now discussing 50 kilometers possible evacuation range. 50 kilometers is in Japan is huge, big. In Tokai, Daini, for instance, Mito City will be included. In the Fukui area, Kyoto City may be included. And Genkai, Kyushu, Fukuoka City may be included. So if you expand the zone to 50 kilometers, the million people have to evacuate. And that's the biggest challenge I see personally for the future of nuclear power plant.
You know, we saw really high levels of anxiety, not only in Japan, in Tokyo, but here in America. I was teaching at the time in the Midwest, some 7,000 miles away from Okuba and Futaba, Fukushima. In my town in Indiana, there were no potassium iodine pills left at all. I had my students call all the local pharmacies. They're all bought out within 2 days. So if 7,000 miles away, Americans are buying out all potassium iodine pills, clearly there's a level of anxiety about radiation. And this is a long-established fact that we know of all the risks human beings face. The dread risks of radiation are the highest. Dread risk meaning because we can't smell radiation, unlike a fire, let's say. We can't see radiation, unlike an accident that's happening in front of us. And we don't know the long-term cumulative effects of exposure. As Suzuki-sensei just said, from internal or external contamination, we have very high levels of anxiety. And I think for me, the long-term problems in Japan hopefully won't be health effects from the radiation, but unfortunately will be questions of the anxiety, of health, of psychological issues that come about from the not knowing what's going on. Professor Tatsuki already suggested this concept of people leaving Tokyo. In fact, I had several colleagues who called me and asked me what they should do. And I was in a very uncomfortable position to tell them, well, I don't know right now. I have children here in America. I lived in Japan before. And I told them if I had kids and I were living near Fukushima, I would evacuate. If I were living in Tokyo, I'm not sure what I would do, honestly. I'm not sure. And many of the Americans that I know evacuated. Some have not yet come back to Tokyo. And of course, there's strong criticism of those foreign workers, the flagging, for fleeing. But I think the reality is the anxiety from radiation is palpable, it is real, and there are measurable health effects, lack of sleep, anxiety, PTSD, and I really hope, in fact, and I have not seen this so much, I really hope that the mental health community in Japan begins an open dialogue about questions of concern, anxiety, insomnia, other physical effects, not because of radiation, but because of concern. I think that really is a long-term problem we're going to see.
I'd like to thank you both for your excellent presentations. I have some questions and comments. I think, Professor Aldrich, you did a really excellent job of providing a framework to think about this problem, which is not merely this problem. It's a problem facing we as people living and existing in various communities all face. Collective action. Now, you referred to social cohesion as kind of a separate, or collective action is different than this kind of social capital issues. I'm not sure I can see them being distinguished. To the extent we have social capital, we can address collective action problems. To the extent that we don't, we can't. An interesting concept that you kind of got close to, it didn't specifically indicate, is wait. Here, in this case, we can see a very clear instance of our government, the Japanese government, and the large corporations not being agents of creating social capital, of purporting to create social capital on our behalf, but instead deliberately finding ways to find weak communities and to undermine communities by bribing them, paying them off so they would look the other way to put these things in their backyard. This is not so different than what we're seeing. Besides, we have this small discussion about nuclear power in Japan, but meanwhile, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and the U.S. has got protests. Protests. Occupy Wall Street. Occupy everything. Occupy your community. We are seeing similar breakdown, or similar, actually, the collective action problem somewhat is people saying, to some degree, we give up authority to somebody else to make decisions for us. We're starting to see that we've made a lot of bad choices by doing that. I wonder if you could comment on that somewhat, Professor Aldrich, but then this also relates then back to Mr. Suzuki. So you indicated the reasons for the problem were a lack of safety culture. Let me offer a different interpretation. It's a lack of accountability and a lack of responsibility. And this is partly results on citizens. We let other people make decisions for us. Here, we let government bureaucrats set safety levels. We don't let people make their own decisions. The people in Miyagi still can't build homes because government doesn't give them permits. We let government control our lives. It's time for people to start taking it back. In the case of nuclear power, so the question, let me wind it up. In case of nuclear power, we could say, instead of we want government to set regulations, is to look to see how did we give up our authority to people who are not accountable.
Let's allow them to
If we just said, for example, for nuclear power, is we eliminate the liability cap, we can bet that the investors will quickly decide, do we want to keep this facility open or not? Instead, we've created a system where nobody's responsible.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Daniel, I think you're first to go.
Yeah, so I think I would agree that the policy tools I brought up in the presentation, and as an author I can't help mentioning, but the book's available, it's called Site Fights on Amazon.com. Those tools have been discovered as well by Japanese social scientists. Koichi Hasegawa, for example, has written some fantastic works, both in English and Japanese, on the nuclear power communities there. And in fact, he called this process the cycle of addiction. He's argued that in communities that were rural and depopulated, the offer of money per year created a process where once you accepted the first nuclear power plant, then the budget was raised to a new level, and to keep the budget high, you had to accept a second nuclear power plant. And he's argued, for example, that's why we see in some areas 6 or 7 nuclear power plants in one community. Like, for example, Kashiozaki Kariwa in Niigata, I believe has 6 or 7 plants there. And he would argue that it is an undermining of existing social capital, social networks, and the use of that money has changed the social framework. So I would agree. I believe that both the American and Japanese governments have tried to use policy instruments deliberately to alter local social capital, recognizing its possible resistance, and then have moved to place these in areas where they're lower. The broader question you asked about the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, what's going on? So I think right now, citizens around the world have passed, many of them have passed, the point where their primary concerns are day-to-day life. They've gotten beyond material concerns to what Engelhardt has called post-material consciousness. And the question now is, okay, if I'm making, as someone living in Egypt, $3,000 or $4,000 a year now, I'm in the middle class in Egypt, what values do I have now? What matters to me most? If I have a job, if I have stable employment, now I can think about who's controlling my life? Who's making decisions for me? Why is the military still in control? Or in America, I think we're seeing now a backlash against a long-term period of profits by banks, for example, and a belief among the average Americans in these protest movements that somehow the government has ignored their voices in their broader decision-making process. So I think we are seeing across the world a post-materialist move, and perhaps in Japan as well. This accident, the silver lining for this accident might be a new approach from citizens to their role in the governance process.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I think that lack of accountability is a problem, I agree, and I think what's happening right now is to distractioning of power, so-called power structure of electric industry and energy industry and so forth. And that will lead to your question of so-called liberalized energy market eventually. And but my feeling is that democracy and market mechanisms are two powerful tools, I agree, to have a so-called rational choice in the energy market. However, I still believe that still you need probably expertise from scientists and engineers to provide you information. The problem is a lack of transparency and biased information, or how do you call the scientists occupied by the government and industry and so on. But those are the problems. But I still believe that, like for instance, we have a serious risk of nuclear power, but we still have also serious risk of climate change and all other things. And so we have to bring all these issues on the table and have I think it's a good chance for us and for Japan right now to actually create again the big debate. But unfortunately, in the short term, we have to make decisions what to do with the existing nuclear power plants. And that's a short-term issue that we have to still resolve. It's very difficult, actually. And clean up the Fukushima area, it's easy to say, leave the decision to the community, but it's not that easy, actually. I tell you, this is a very difficult question we are facing. And we have to work together, that's for sure. It's not the government itself can make our decisions. We need to work with the people, we need to work with everybody.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Michael?
I would like to say this with all due respect, but both of you noted that what we should have learned, blah, 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 was technology is dangerous. But I would think what we have learned is that METI, MIDI, and the Japanese government has failed the Japanese people. And since we're running out of time to say this quickly, NISA, or NISI, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, silenced people who brought up claims. It faltered documents, and we know this. And METI, which its job is to promote the nuclear industry, was also in charge of regulating it, which we know was stupid. So, with all due respect, we moved the regulatory agency to the Ministry of Environment, which is not only politically weaker than METI and the Minister of Finance. So there's no way that not only an expert, but a politically appointed from the DPJ's groups or the LDP's faction leader has no way of standing up to the METI director. But it also is indebted to the nuclear energy because of the Kyoto particles and how it wants to lower CO2 emissions. So you moved the agency from one part of government that wants to promote nuclear energy to another. So what we have learned is that the bureaucracy is unchecked, the Prime Minister doesn't matter, and that the Minister of Environment is just going to be a puppet of the Minister of the Industry. So shouldn't we have learned that it's not nuclear energy that's dangerous, because no one's ever died of nuclear energy except for workers fighting nuclear accidents, and they don't really count. So what have we learned is that, no offense, Professor Suzuki, and you seem very intelligent and you really want to change things, but if the bureaucracy doesn't change and nuclear regulatory doesn't become a cabinet position like it was proposed to, and instead belongs to bureaucracy, you're just going to have another Fukushima 20 years down the road. And to point out, even though it's academics, an academic who fought was silenced.
You have a point.
Yeah. Go ahead. You want to respond?
I just want to do my best at giving my position. There are big discussion which agency is the best place to go. There are many considerations. We'll see. And we still have time to debate for where to put the safety agency. But the point is, I think, again, the real capability of the bureaucrats is a key issue. And see what happens. And unfortunately, I can't do much at this moment.
Daniel, did you want to?
Just very quickly, I don't think it's just the Japanese bureaucracy that has been affected by a moral hazard. Of course, in America, the BP oil spill was a consequence of the same agency that collects the fees from places like BP and Shell has to regulate them. So in any case, both America and Japan have agencies with moral hazards. That is, the agencies charged with keeping people safe also are strongly in favor of what the agency is doing. So I think you're right. Certainly for a long time now, for 50-odd years, when the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, ANRE, has been in METI or MITI, there has been a moral hazard there. And the question, I agree with you, will the environment industry have any more power? I don't see it right now. And I think you're right, this is a broader question of administration, but on top of that, it's also a question for the citizens, right? What is the average African citizen got to write in their congressman or their dean and say, do you want to change here, do you want to make something different? That's up to the citizens of Japan to push harder for reform.
Okay. So last question. The next to last question.
I've got a fairly specific question. For years, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has told us that. Okay, sorry. For years, the Ministry of Economy has told us that nuclear power is far more cost-effective than any of the alternatives on a per kilowatt-hour basis. Since the accident, we've heard from a lot of academics who have said that they have been unable to get the details from the ministry or from the power companies as to how those per kilowatt-hour costs were arrived at. There are a lot of claims that, for example, these subsidies that are given to the local governments are not included, that, and also going forward, it seems that many of the nuclear power plants will have to be refurbished with more stringent safety measures. Are those costs going to be figured in to the cost of nuclear power? Is the ministry and are the energy companies going to be more transparent in how they come up with those costs? And what is that going to mean in the energy mix that Japan selects going forward? Particularly the cost of solar energy is dropping phenomenally. And is this all going to be made transparent by this commission that you're working on?
Yeah, this is actually we are working on right now, and we Atomic Energy Commission just published the figure for nuclear fuel cycle portion and also accident risk cost. And all the data is on the website, in Japanese unfortunately, but it's on the website, and you can look at all the assumptions and so on. And as you say, the government does not trust METI's figure anymore, so they set up the independent cost verification committee or whatever, and they are going to compare the cost. It will be finished by the end of the year. And my guess is right now, nuclear power generation cost will be probably somewhere in between coal and natural gas. And so it used to be cheaper than coal and natural gas, but it's probably more expensive than coal. But if you include the carbon price, it's relatively equal, probably. It's not that different. But I think the cost is only part of the question, as you say. You have to compare the risk of all power sources. And probably, as you said, the energy mix will be completely different from what we have discussed before March 11th. But it takes time. The infrastructure, existing power plants can last also another 20, 30 years. So it will probably take decades to shift, but its direction will completely probably different from the past.
Yeah, it's very interesting that Japan will have to grapple with the different balancing, the costs and risks and other factors to see what they're going to do with nuclear power. In this debate, how crucial is the view of some people, whether you agree with them or not politically, that this technology is important to have nuclear weapons capability, maybe not as a real option, but as a conceptual option?
That is a question regarding the nuclear fuel cycle, so-called, and particularly the enrichment and the reprocessing technologies. And this is going to be the key issue in the next 6 months period of discussion, whether we should keep the nuclear fuel cycle program alive. It is already known it is very expensive, but because of in the past, because of the energy security concern, we want to recycle the nuclear fuel. But it means also Japan will have a potential nuclear weapon capability. So this is going to be discussed in the next 6 months. Personally, it's better not to have it, but since we have low pressure reprocessing plant already, so what to do with this is a big question. So see what happens. But that's your question is what we're taking.
And Daniel, I think you'll have the last word.
Yeah, just last thought. One of my colleagues, Jacques Hyman, has been writing about this question about is nuclear energy a symbol, a sign, a possible transfer to nuclear weapons, proliferation concerns. He argues that the industry is so rigid, ironically in Japan, that the probability that it will ever be used for weapons is pretty unlikely, but I think there is a concern about proliferation here. That is, what's going to happen in the long term in terms of terrorist risk or theft or loss of material. In fact, there was a period in the 1990s, I remember in Japan, I think 24 kilograms of plutonium were missing. They were missing because there was a miscounting at some of the agricultural facilities, and they literally couldn't find 55 pounds or whatever. So I think that is a broader concern to think about, which is how will we see Japan's role, not only in terms of proliferation concerns, but also the conversion to nuclear weapons country.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Aldrich and Suzuki for their insightful comments, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, bye-bye.